Once roaming prehistoric Australia, it wasn't kangaroos hopping everywhere, but the unique-looking Diprotodon, the largest marsupial to ever live. With a massive head-short snout and two distinct front incisors, they didn't resemble any animal that exists today. Their stocky and colossal body was similar to a hornless rhinoceros or a hippopotamus, yet their closest relatives are the koala and wombat. These giants once dominated the plains of Australia, leaving behind mysterious traces that scientists are still working to decipher today. How does an animal that shares ancestry with wombats and koalas end up rivaling a rhinoceros in size? That is the puzzle of Diprotodon. Its closest living relatives climb trees and nibble leaves, rarely weighing more than a few dozen kilograms. Yet here stood an animal towering 1.6 to 1.8 meters at the shoulder, stretching several meters in length and weighing roughly 2.5 to 3 tons, most estimates clustering around 2,700 to 2,800 kilograms. Imagine a creature whose bulk matched the grazing titans of Africa, but carried in a lineage no larger today than a wombat. To picture it clearly, think of legs like pillars holding up an immense frame. Its limb bones were straight and columnar, much like those of elephants, a feature discovered in fossil femora and humeri that reveals just how specialized its anatomy was for bearing weight. The chest was broad and barrel-like its skull, elongated with two oversized incisors jutting forward like chisel blades. Next to a standing person, a Diprotodon's shoulder would rise above your head. Beside a wombat, it would look like a living caricature of scale. Why would Australia, of all places, produce such a giant? The answer lies in its Pleistocene landscape. Back then, the continent wasn't only desert and scrub as it is today. Much of Sahuel, the combined prehistoric landmass of Australia and New Guinea, was covered in open woodland and expansive grassland. For a herbivore, roaming vast patchy environments, being large, carried distinct advantages. Massive bodies hold water longer and maintain internal temperature more effectively in extreme heat. They also walk farther before tiring, which meant Diprotodon herds could cover hundreds of kilometers in search of food and water, thriving where smaller animals might struggle. Diprotodon's family history also helps explain its size. The broader Diprotodontid lineage, an extended family tree that includes wombats and numerous extinct browsers, shows a repeated trend toward bigger and bigger species over time. Fossils chart a steady escalation, almost like an evolutionary experiment in gigantism, culminating with Diprotodon as the extreme outcome. This wasn't a random accident, it was the product of selective pressures that favoured large, mobile herbivores in a harsh, fluctuating continent. Predators existed, but their influence was limited. Lions and bears never roamed ancient Australia, but Diprotodon did share its world with the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo giant, monitor lizards like Megalania varanus priscus, and large crocodiles. These hunters were formidable, but most likely they threatened only calves or sick adults. A healthy 3-ton animal with column-like limbs and sheer bulk would have been a dangerous target, discouraging all but the boldest predator. Its size itself became both shield and strategy. Still, gigantism came at a price. Sustaining a body mass of nearly 3 tons required extraordinary amounts of food and water, and Pleistocene Australia was a land of extremes. Rainfall varied sharply across the continent, and periods of aridity could transform fertile grasslands into dry plains in a matter of generations. For Diprotodon, success and vulnerability were two sides of the same adaptation. The very size that enabled survival during good times could become a liability when resources dwindled. What makes Diprotodon remarkable is that it sustained this way of life for tens of thousands of years. No other marsupial living or extinct reached such proportions. By expanding into the ecological role, often filled by elephants, rhinos, or bison elsewhere, Diprotodon proved that marsupials could evolve into the great grazers and browsers of their own continent. It wasn't a mistake of evolution, but rather the most extreme form of a trajectory set in motion long before its time. In that sense, Diprotodon represents the peak of Diprotodontid evolution. Massive, slow, durable, and adapted to a shifting environment by sheer scale alone. But size and weight answer only part of its story. To carry such a mass day after day, it needed constant fuel. And the real key to understanding how this marsupial giant survived lies not in its bones, but in its teeth.
Keeping a body that large nourished in the dry landscapes of Pleistocene Australia required specialised equipment, and the most important of those tools was in its mouth. Diprotodon had ever-growing front incisors and broad bilophodont molars, a rare combination that let it scrape, crush and grind both woody stems and grasses. This gave it the ability to switch between food sources as the environment shifted a survival edge in a land where droughts and fires could strip whole regions bare. The incisors stood out first. Long and curved forward, they grew continuously and maintained sharp edges through constant wear. They worked like chisels, slicing into hard stems, peeling bark and cutting through roots. Smaller animals would have struggled with the tough, fibrous plants Diprotodon consumed, but these teeth handled them with efficiency. Behind them, the ridged molars took over, their two vertical crests pressed together like rollers, crushing leaves and stalks into a chewable pulp. The power behind this chewing was extraordinary. Reconstructions of Diprotodon's jaw mechanics point to a bite force of about 2,300 to 2,400 newtons at the incisors, and as much as 4,100 to over 11,000 newtons at the molars. That kind of pressure explains how it could break down woody twigs and fibrous grasses as easily as softer foliage. The vertical crushing action was more like an elephant's downward bite than the side-to-side chewing of most marsupials. With every bite, the jaws pulverized bulk vegetation into manageable form, fueling an animal that outweighed nearly everything else in its ecosystem. This feeding strategy meant Diprotodon was not confined to one ecological role. A cow specializes in grass, a giraffe in high leaves. Diprotodon fits neither category. It combined traits from grazers and browsers shaped by evolutionary pressures that rewarded versatility in a land of extremes. Even compared to its closest living relatives, the contrast is striking. Koalas are highly selective leaf eaters, wombats crop grass steadily, but this giant relative carried both strategies in one dentition, scaled up to support a 3-ton frame. The ecological consequences of such eating power were far-reaching. Consuming huge amounts of shrubs and grasses meant Diprotodon directly shaped its environment. Vast herds would have opened up corridors through woodlands, slowed the spread of woody plants, and influenced vegetation mosaics. In turn, these changes affected fire frequency, giving more room for flammable grasses, and altering the balance of ecosystems across the continent. Like elephants in Africa or bison in North America, Diprotodon left an unmistakable mark on its landscapes simply by feeding. This unusual mix of anatomical features and ecological role set Diprotodon apart from every other marsupial. Its dentition gave it the adaptability to endure fluctuations in food supply that would have starved more specialized species. Yet eating was only part of the challenge. Finding enough food often meant moving across enormous distances, especially when the seasons turned harsh. Understanding how it accomplished those movements opens the next chapter of its story, one that reveals behaviors few would expect from a marsupial of any size. For much of scientific history, marsupials were seen as stay-at-home creatures. Koalas rarely leave their trees, kangaroos follow patchy grasslands only short distances after rain, and wombats defend fixed burrow systems. None was thought capable of long, predictable journeys like the great migrations of caribou or wildebeest. That assumption shifted when scientists turned their attention to the teeth of Diprotodon. Against all expectations, this giant revealed evidence of repeated seasonal travel. In fact, Diprotodon remains the only known metatherian, living or extinct, with direct proof of seasonal two-way migration. The breakthrough came from a fossil unearthed in the Darling Downs of Queensland, an area that in the Pleistocene was a fertile floodplain and today stretches as farmland and river valley terrain. One exceptionally preserved Diprotodon incisor was analysed in detail. Like an archive pressed into enamel, it preserved a running record of the animal's diet and movements in its final years. The crucial evidence was in strontium. Because strontium from local rock enters plants and water, it passes into the tissues of animals that consume them. Scientists measured 86 strontium along the length of Diprotodon's ever-growing incisor. The shifting ratios acted like geographic fingerprints, each change mapped onto a different geologic province the animal had crossed. The pattern did not show random wandering. Instead, it revealed regular alternation bands from one terrain, then another, and back again etched like barcodes. This meant the animal was returning to the same regions in a recurring cycle. Teeth add these chemical layers slowly over weeks and months, meaning the record stretched across several seasons. In effect, the incisor had become a diary recording each stage in mineral shorthand. When researchers compared the isotope bands to the distances between those provinces, the scale of the movements became stark. The tooth chemistry implies seasonal round trips of roughly 200 kilometers. For a marsupial lineage never associated with long migrations, this was astonishing. The repeated journeys resembled the seasonal tracks of African elephants or wildebeest, not the localized foraging of wombats. Far from being tied to one feeding ground, Diprotodon herds appear to have followed rivers and floodplains that shifted between wet season lushness and dry season scarcity. Such movement makes ecological sense. A 3-ton herbivore required massive amounts of forage, and local resources could not sustain it indefinitely. Migration spreads the demand across vast areas, preventing overgrazing of single patches and ensuring herds can pursue the freshest vegetation. With stamina provided by sheer size limbs built for endurance rather than speed, Diprotodon was physically equipped to cover the distances without exhausting itself. The behavior likely carried whole groups, mothers with calves, maturing juveniles, and robust adults traveling in parallel across open country. This evidence altered how scientists understood marsupial ecology. One lineage within this broader group had, under selective pressure, evolved large-scale migratory behavior to survive in a continent governed by harsh cycles of aridity and rainfall. Seasonal movement was their answer to unpredictability. Unlike smaller relatives that could hide in burrows or subsist locally, Diprotodon turned mobility into its greatest advantage. The isotopic signatures confirm migration as an established part of its biology, not mere speculation. On a global scale, no other marsupial or extinct metatherian shows such a patterned seasonal motion. Diprotodon occupies a unique place, behaving more like mega-herbivores on other continents than like any of its own kin. Its story shows adaptation at its most unexpected. A marsupial giant not only survived by eating broadly, but also by walking steadily across landscapes to chase seasonal abundance. But even a reliable migration pattern had limits. Regular journeys could not guarantee safety. When drought deepened, water vanished, or the land itself became a trap. In some places, long walks ended in catastrophe, but migration couldn't save them from certain kinds of drought traps, and Lake Callabonna tells that story. At Lake Callabonna in South Australia, an entire drama of Diprotodon life and death is preserved in the ground itself. Excavations have revealed up to several hundred individuals, historically reported at around 360 many, still lying in life positions where they became trapped. Unlike other fossil beds where bones were scattered here, whole skeletons remained in place, with column-like legs locked into hardened clay and skulls tilted as if frozen in mid-struggle. It is one of the rarest kinds of evidence paleontologists can find, a near-complete assemblage that captures not just anatomy, but an actual moment of catastrophe. The surface of the lake once carried a deceptive crust of salt, concealing soft mud underneath. A light kangaroo might pass safely, but animals weighing nearly 3 tons had little chance once their feet pressed through. Step by step, the Diprotodon sank deeper until its own mass worked against it. The fossil record preserves this grim reality, showing animals of all ages, towering adults lying near calves no bigger than a pony. Entire herds from juveniles to elders had entered the trap together and died together, making this site as much a record of social behavior as of death. The assemblage at Callabonna also includes the remains of other extinct megafauna, such as the giant short-faced kangaroo Protemnodon, the massive browsing kangaroo Sthenurus, and the huge flightless bird Genyornis. Their presence suggests that the shrinking lake was once a focal point for competing species, all desperate for water in an arid cycle. The high salinity of the water likely made it undrinkable, but the marshy edges still drew animals in, especially during dry spells. In such conditions, crowding intensified risk, and large herbivores pressing close together would have found themselves locked in mud from which no escape was possible. Not every skeleton remained pristine. While the legs were often well preserved, shielded once they sank out of reach, the upper bodies told a harsher story. Some skulls show crushing damage, possibly from trampling by other Diprotodon as they struggled nearby. Others bear marks consistent with erosion by wind-driven salt or collapse under the stress of their own movements. These details confirm that the site was not a quiet grave, but the aftermath of an intense, prolonged struggle. For researchers, such marks are not just scars of death, but clues to herd interactions, animals crowding together, jostling for footing, perhaps even remaining alongside trapped companions as they weakened.
Importantly, Calabona represents a local mass mortality event, not the single cause of Diprotodon's extinction. It offers a snapshot of one herd caught under particular conditions, likely tied to drought and treacherous mud rather than a continent-wide collapse. Sites like this help scientists reconstruct how environmental stress and aridity affected the species, while still reminding us that extinction was the result of multiple overlapping factors unfolding over thousands of years.
The size and preservation of the bones drew human attention long before modern science. For many Indigenous Australians, massive fossils eroding out of salt lakes became linked with stories of mysterious water beings, sometimes associated with bunyip traditions. Some researchers have also proposed that certain pieces of Aboriginal rock art or folklore may reference giant marsupials like Diprotodon, though these interpretations remain debated and uncertain. What is clear is that Calabona connects geological deep time with cultural memory on the land, underscoring how such remains could shape stories carried forward for generations. Standing over these skeletons today, paleontologists see not only colossal fossils, but the traces of behavior herds traveling together, young alongside adults, forced into choices by shifting climates. It is a stark vision of vulnerability. The site reminds us that even giants moving steadily across landscapes could be stopped cold by a drying lake bed. And that raises a larger question, one still unresolved. After surviving drought's predation and the challenges of mobility, what finally drove Diprotodon to vanish for good climate stress, human arrival, or both at once? That question takes us beyond a single lake bed and into the broader legacy of Diprotodon itself, its role as a giant herbivore, a shaper of landscapes, and an animal whose disappearance forever changed the ecology of Australia. In conclusion, Diprotodon was more than just a massive marsupial. Its disappearance left long-lasting consequences for the Australian environment. While the exact cause remains debated, it could be due to climate change, the arrival of humans, or both. Fossils and ancient evidence are still key to unraveling the mystery of this giant's extinction.